I'm Rachel Horgan. Join me each episode as I sit down with a guest co-host covering the latest business stories in the Seattle area. We'll read the news so you don't have to. This is The Weekly. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I have been really obsessed with the show Severance. I watched season 1 a couple years ago. Season 2 just came out. Are you watching it?
We're not watching it yet.
Oh, you gotta watch it. It's produced by Ben Stiller. It stars Adam Scott, and it was written by Dan Erickson. So I've been listening to the podcast where they recap each episode from season 1.
Nice.
And they brought on Dan, the writer, and he was talking about the original script for the pilot was like much more fantastical and like really like the tone was like really out there.
Yeah.
And what I liked about the episode is that he was like, I think it had to be really out there to get to like where they were now, like because it's still kind of a weird show. And I thought that was kind of cool because it reminds me of, we're going to be talking a lot about startups today, where like your crazy idea, it kind of has to be crazy and like maybe not possible to end up here. Because if you started really safe, you never would have gotten to this idea. So anyway, that's what I've been doing with my time. So the voice you hear is Ken Horenstein, founder and general partner at Pack Ventures. Hi, Ken.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to do this, Rachel.
Yeah. Well, we should explain how you came to be here is that I know your girlfriend, Andrea.
Yep.
She's my point of contact over at Four Seasons. So I've done countless events with her, and she's just such a boss bitch with her running every event in her heels over there at Four Seasons. And a long time ago, she told me, it's like, oh yeah, my boyfriend's like in tech and startup. I'm like, yeah, what boyfriend isn't in tech and startup? Whatever. I like didn't even pay attention to it. And she texted me after an episode and was like, hey, you know that Ken that you just quoted in your last episode? I was like, yeah. She's like, that's the Ken. That's my Ken. And I was like, no. So he's actually like a big deal. Okay.
Amazing.
So that's where you were kind of first on my radar. And then, I know we're going to talk about your wine company later, but you did a tasting. So it's just kind of funny how we all end up here on the podcast. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Seattle is such a small community that we all end up crossing paths in some way or another, whether it's through wine or through startups or, podcasts. So I'm excited.
I also want to thank you for hosting work here at UW, and nothing makes me come alive more than being on a college campus. It just makes me feel like excited and hopeful, and I want to like cram for a test or something. So It feels good to be here.
Yeah.
I want to give a little more background on you, as that you've been with Pack Ventures, a VC fund here, for 4 years. And before that, he was the co-founder of Venture Out Seattle, another VC. And prior to that, worked at M12, which is Microsoft's venture fund. He got his MBA at UW here, and you're currently a mentor for CoMotion at UW.
Yeah. And double dog, as we say. So I did both undergrad and grad school at UW.
Okay.
So this kind of feels, having a fund based out of UW feels like a third time through UW, which is really cool.
I have a drinking game with my friends. Every time I bring up college, I have to drink, and I feel like you might need to join this game.
Sends you right back to college.
I know. And then the last thing is, I briefly mentioned you're a co-founder of A Posto Vino because you are also a sommelier.
Correct. Yeah, that's the side hobby and passion with Andrea that not as many people know about, but I think we'll talk about a little bit today.
We are, yeah. So give us a sense about, I know there's a lot of different is it VC firms or funds?
Yeah, firm.
Fund. There's a lot here in Seattle. Give us a sense of how big yours is in comparison, whether that's number of companies that you've worked with or the dollar amount, give us a sense.
Yeah, so we actually just signing our 32nd company that we've backed, and that's since late 2021. So that's pretty fast and quite a lot of portfolio companies for a fund of our size. We're actually raising our second fund right now. So we've got a little over 15 million under management. Most venture funds don't really share those numbers, but I think it's important for founders to know who they're dealing with when they come talk to investors. And so we are probably going to add another 6 to 10 companies to our portfolio this year. We're super active. We often do 10 to 12 investments every year, and we get involved at the pre-seed and seed stages is what we call it. And so really it's like idea stage to maybe $1 million in revenue.
Okay.
We want to be one of the first, if not the very first venture fund that a founder talks to. And oftentimes, like a number of our startups, we start talking to them 2 years before they even had a company.
Wow.
And giving them advice, perspectives. Hey, you could go left, you could go right here. Here's someone else you need to talk to. And I think that's kind of the ethos of our style is we get involved super early. yeah, so that's been a little bit.
How does that
about us.
compare to some of the big ones like Madrona or something? Or do you have a sense of how big they are?
Yeah, I think Madrona is now in the couple $1 billion, but they're also on their, they're in double-digit funds at this point, and they've been doing it for almost 30 years. So we'd love to be there at some point. I don't know if that particular style is what we're going to do. But then you have Fuse Ventures, which is also in the couple $100 million at this point. Then we've got a whole cadre of other funds that we partner with all the time who are kind of staying medium size. So each fund might be $25 million to $50 million, very intentional to say stay at that size. There's this saying in venture that your fund size is your strategy.
Oh.
So if you are a $10 billion fund, you have to put a lot of money to work. It's actually harder for you to write small checks than it is for you to write a $100 million check. Same amount of work, probably more management of the company because it's a little bit less developed company. And so the bigger their fund gets, typically the later stage startup you might participate in, the more proof points that might be there. They're going to be 10 million in revenue, 100 million in revenue kind of thing. And you really can't do as much work with really small, young companies. It's just, if you had to spend the same amount of time, you're going to spend more time with the company that got $100 million.
Yeah.
And so, there's a group of us here in Seattle that are kind of staying in this band where we want each fund to be $20 to $100 million because we want to stay focused on that idea stage founder who's maybe doing this for the first time, needs a bit more hand-holding and support as we go and more advice. So, that's kind of how we think about it.
I love it. I like that stage, the idea stage of things, because maintaining something is a different challenge than building something.
100%. So when I was at M12, we were predominantly a Series A and Series B investor. So the companies we would look at would have more like $2 to $10 million in revenue for the most part, not every deal, but most of them. The VC process is so different than what I do. And so I had also been kind of interning with an angel fund here that was the same stage of deals that we do now. And this is much more at our stage, mentorship, guidance, advisory, roll up your sleeves, help them a bit more, right? It's similar with a Pioneer Square Labs or a Madrona Venture Labs. When you get to those later stages, it's more about the machine's been built and we're trying to optimize and turn certain cranks. And we kind of know what the cranks are, right? At a certain stage, you can feed a company's data into essentially an Excel spreadsheet and say, does this deserve more capital or not?
Yeah.
That just isn't my necessarily style of investing. I want to talk through and work through the nitty gritty and say, hey, you want to go right here. I've seen 25, 30, 50 companies in this space, and maybe I've already invested in one or two that are similar. You don't need to learn this from scratch.
Yeah.
Let me show you some of the best practices so that you can do in a month what would have taken you a year. Yeah. And that's, to me, kind of the traditional venture capital is very much a apprenticeship, stewardship kind of business. And we went a little bit away from that over the last decade.
I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but I am curious about the beginnings of things, as we just talked about. So you work at a lot of different companies for VC, and then you decide at some point that you want to do it yourself. How did that start? Because obviously to start some sort of VC fund, you need a lot of capital, I would guess. So what was the beginnings of that?
Yeah, I was actually approached by two people, Matt McElwain from Madrona and Chris DeVore from Founders Co-op. And they were working with both the president and the provost of the time of the University of Washington. And they were working on this idea of this is one of the greatest research institutions on the planet, but there seemed to be a little bit of a gap when it came to commercialization. How could we enable more commercialization? And this model exists at Harvard and Stanford and MIT and Cal, where you have an independent but strongly partnered and affiliated venture fund that helps bridge what we call that valley of death of funding, which is the very first money into a company, kind of an institutional structure to it to really prepare the company for more funding. And so they came to me and said, hey, we've sketched this out at the 50,000 foot level. How would you build it? How would you run it? And, they didn't just talk to me, they talked to a lot of people. And I came back with kind of a 100-foot plan and said, here's tactically how we'd go build this. And eventually they said, okay, you should build this thing. We'll help you. We'll advise you. We'll introduce you to potential investors. And probably most importantly, we'll share really good deals with you in the early years so that you can get foot in the door and established as a new venture fund. And that's a really rare thing. I think what Matt and Chris saw was when you compare UW to our research peers, we're top 3 in funding. It's us, Harvard, and Johns Hopkins every year for about 20 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We license more intellectual property, which could be a startup or it could just be another company's product, more than MIT, Stanford, and Carnegie Mellon combined.
Dang.
But you look at funded founders and we were 20th on the list. And so it's like we've got all the resources, all the inputs, but there seems to be this big gap into turning that into companies. And so that's what I looked at with them and said, okay, let's help the university turn more of this incredible research into industry-defining companies that impact patient lives, impact consumers, impact businesses. And that was in 2021, and that's what we've been doing since.
That's awesome. I love that. Okay, I mean, I could talk to you about this all day. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it throughout the episode. The top stories for you today, we're going to cover the TikTok story. I felt like we couldn't not. It's so, trending. And there is a Seattle angle to it. We do have a Bellevue office here. Anyway, we'll get into it. And then the next one is looking at VCs in general, kind of how did they do in 2024 and what's to come in 2025. Our next story will be about Meta. They have said that they're going to lay off 5% of their workforce based on merit. And our last story is about Capitol Hill's Rapport is closing indefinitely, or did close indefinitely. So, to begin.
Let's do it. I'm ready.
Okay, there's so many places we could take this TikTok story, and I think that I'm going to do my best about just explaining the timeline of what happened, because this is a business podcast, so kind of in terms of their business, what happened. And then we can kind of go from there. So jump in at any point here, but it starts in 2012. ByteDance is founded. And a little later, this company, Musical.ly, is a lip-syncing app, and that's also started by a China entrepreneur. And in 2016, a couple of years later, ByteDance launches this video sharing app for the Chinese. It's really popular. They do a spinoff called TikTok. And ByteDance acquires that Musical.ly app that I was talking about, that lip-syncing app, and they combine it with TikTok. And so they're going along fine until 2019. The U.S. is like, "Ooh, hey now, I think you're violating some child privacy laws and you need to pay a fine." And it was kind of, in my understanding, right after 2019, different newspapers start picking up on things. So the Washington Post, the Guardian, they start reporting that things seem a little off with TikTok in terms of censoring some information or just their algorithm in general. TikTok hires a former Disney exec, Kevin Mayer, as their CEO, but then he resigns 3 months later. India bans TikTok. And in 2020, Trump gives this kind of vague executive order that he's going to ban companies from working with ByteDance. And then he just kind of doesn't really do much. TikTok sues the Trump administration saying you can't do this because of the First Amendment. And this is right around the time where Biden takes office. So basically, I think they started this conversation, but then they're like, let's not deal with it right now. So Biden kind of puts it off. In the meantime, you still have more like Wall Street journals coming up with, saying that there's issues with teens and eating disorders. There's violence. You're just seeing more concern. FBI raises concerns in 2022. So nothing's really happening other than people kind of coming up with issues. Was there more?
And I think right around that time in 2022-ish is when I started to hear stories about TikTok China and TikTok America feeds are drastically different.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And so people are showing, screenshotting videos and what the algorithm is in China versus what the algorithm is in America. And in China, it's very educational. It's very kid-friendly. It's very positive. And in America, it's much more addiction-focused. Like, I want to keep you locked in. Violent things maybe are a little bit more prominent because people watch them more. And so all of a sudden, that raises alarms of, wait a minute. Why do we have two totally different products? And what is the interest of having two totally different products? Yeah.
Definitely. So 2023, the legislators are grilling the CEO. And then 2024 is where it gets a little more serious. This is when the Congress passes the bill to either sell the company or ban the app.
Almost unanimously, I believe.
Okay.
Which is,
like, for the first time ever. Yeah.
Political climate is crazy.
Can't agree on healthcare, but an app here, we all are on the same page, I guess. And the Senate approves, and then President Biden signs. So this went through all the regular legal channels. TikTok then appeals, and they sue, and the federal appeals court unanimously upheld the law. I was like, no, sorry, TikTok, like we're going to stick with our ruling.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court also unanimously is like, yeah, this isn't happening. So you're seeing, shockingly, everybody in the U.S. government agreeing that this app needs to go away.
Yeah.
And then Trump comes into office and asks the Supreme Court to pause the ban so he can kind of figure something out. Some unusual stuff that happened is that there's a notification. I'm on TikTok, so we can talk about that, but I got a notification.
So we can dive into that.
I got a notification that it said a law in the U.S. was enacted, which means you can't use TikTok for now. We're fortunate that President Trump has indicated that he will work with us on a solution to reinstate it. I just want to note that was before, it was on the 18th. So that was before he was sworn in. Odd. And odd that an app would list a president. Not like we're not working with the U.S. government, working with the Trump administration, like specifically his name. Mm-hmm. And then the next day on the 19th, as a result of President Trump's effort, TikTok is back in the U.S. Yeah. Take the floor. What do you have to say to this?
I mean, the main thing is I'm like super excited for the Netflix series about all this.
Oh, like God,
it just wrote itself, and it's incredible. I think other things that I paid attention to in this that were interesting to me is Biden signed the law, but then immediately said, I'm not going to enforce it. And then you have Trump coming in and saying, I'm also not going to enforce it. And so in my view, two people that are almost diametrically opposed, both saying they're not going to listen to the will of essentially the people through elected leaders who voted to ban this thing, and also not listen to the judicial system. Both of those things are just worrying to me as an American for a few different reasons. Like, there is checks and balances in this for a reason, and so we should have that, and listen to those votes. The other thing is, and you and I talked about this a little bit briefly, is I actually have never had TikTok. I don't ever use it. It is not on my phone. I personally think it is Chinese spyware.
Okay.
But I don't have Meta. Mm-hmm. I don't have Instagram. I don't have the Twitter app. And so this is just American spyware. Mm-hmm. I don't know that we've seen anything definitively that said, here is what is being done with TikTok from the Chinese government in a way that is worse or different than what any of these American companies are doing. But I also see the flip side of this of, okay, we've obviously as a society said this is okay to happen in America if you're an American company. There is methods for us to, take care of those issues, although whether or not they actually get taken care of is a whole different podcast probably. And maybe that is not the case with TikTok because it is foreign owned. And so I probably, if I had to guess, TikTok is going to be acquired. We could talk about, I've heard everyone from Elon to Mr. Beast to the US government is going to actually own 50% to, Oracle. Mm-hmm. Who knows who's going to actually own this thing? But I think this is probably Trump being a little bit of Trump to force a deal so that someone that he's closer to or the US government or somehow probably will benefit from this. Who he's going to anoint with this probably $40 to $100 billion asset, I don't really know. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on the point that this is a bigger picture problem of data privacy and influence on everybody's life. I think there's one thought of I don't really care if they know what kind of shoes I like and they give me ads for shoes, but it's so much more than that because it can really shift culture and it can shift what your belief system and all of this. It's a really powerful tool, these social media apps. And so I guess I agree in the sense that I also think Meta is a problem, and I also it's all a problem. And I don't think I heard somebody say playing whack-a-mole with social media apps isn't really the solution. Just shutting down TikTok doesn't really solve a lot. The other side of me I get a little concerned about because TikTok is a way that a lot of people consume news, and now I'm a little concerned about am I only going to be fed Meta, news through Meta? That's also a concern. So I typically wouldn't bring in so much politics into this podcast, but when you have every CEO of every major tech company at the inauguration, I mean, I feel like we can't not talk about it. And it's really the intersection between big tech and government. You can't ignore it anymore.
Yeah. And if I had to guess here too, I think the fact that the two people running for the highest office in the land, that probably have the biggest reach of any two people on the planet. And we're incredibly reliant on both Twitter and Facebook in the last cycle, both of them to agree that you shouldn't just actually follow the laws that were passed and ban this thing. There's probably an incentive here where they see how important this is for their future election. And the question is, are they putting, Americans in some way at risk here for a political type of gain, right?
Well, because this conversation happened the election last year, 4 years ago, and now the election here. Yeah.
Totally.
Okay, I could totally spiral on this, but I want to talk a little bit about if someone were to start a social app today. So I mentioned that this app started, a version of them started in 2012. If someone were to start a social media app today, how much funding do you think they would need?
Yeah, so this is super interesting because maybe the fastest growing social media app started in the last 3 or 4 years is actually based here in Seattle with Blue Sky.
I've heard of Blue Sky, yeah.
I mean, it just
I didn't know it was here.
Hugely popular during this election cycle because it was almost positioned either, I don't know if it was positioned by the company itself, but it was kind of positioned as the anti-X, anti-Elon Twitter. And, the original co-founder of the company is Jack Dorsey. And it started with Jack Dorsey had this idea of the anonymity is really important for Twitter, but that can go too far and it can lead to negative impacts. And so what if we actually leverage the blockchain to help us verify information, file this away. If someone deletes it, we still have a record of it, all of these different things. And so that was kind of going to be Twitter 2.0. What's interesting to me, I've seen TikTok, YouTube Shorts, Instagram, I've seen all of these things and Andrea definitely uses them pretty frequently. They all take a really similar form factor, and they end up, even if they're different to start with, they always converge towards the same kind of experience.
That's how I feel about dating apps too.
Totally. And, we spend more time thinking about what does the future of something look like. We don't do much social, so I haven't thought about this deeply for this particular category. But I'm less interested in companies that are super iterative. And I don't know that anyone has come up with a breakthrough. This is a totally different way to engage your community, the broader global community, et cetera. But on the question of funding, with social apps, there's a couple key things that you need. One is you need network effects. So every time a user gets added to the platform becomes more valuable. And you also need virality. So every user that you gain actually gains N+1. They send it to a person, they send it to 2 people, 10 people, whatever it is. And the cost of that is probably going to be way higher than the cost of the infrastructure and other things today.
So it's a marketing cost? Is that what you're saying?
And it's we call it the cold start problem. If it's not valuable to you as the first user, how many users does it take for it to become valuable to you? Maybe it's 100, maybe it's 1,000, maybe it's 10,000, maybe it's 10 million. And then it's not just the users, it's the content they produce.
Right.
And so how do you incentivize and enable that to happen? The biggest companies in the world had carrots in their platforms that got people to give them that super valuable information for free. And I'm just wondering, again, not as a consumer investor, I'm just wondering if we are exhausting what those things we can share with people are that would convince them to come back. That is in a different form factor than we have today.
Yeah.
I don't know that anyone has even just personally pitched me a social media app that I didn't think could happen on YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, whatever it is. And so, yeah, okay. I might not be the right person to answer that, but I just
what you said is valuable. It's interesting. Yeah.
How do you overcome that big hurdle of getting started for something like this?
Yeah. I mean, I think you answer it in that money isn't your problem with starting a social media app. It's getting everybody else on it, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to move on to the world of VCs. So there's two articles I put in there for you. One was looking back at 2024 and kind of what are we seeing for VCs. And then the other one was looking forward to 2025. The one looking forward for 2025 was actually a recap on GeekWire of an event that you were at. You were on the panel and discussing it. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But we're going to start with 2024. So looking back, the article said that Seattle area startups secured around $600 million in Q4, the last quarter. And that's down about $1 billion from the previous quarters, which I thought sounded bad. But then when you look at the year overall it's about $3 billion in 2024 and compared to about $3.1 billion in 2023.
Yeah.
Something in the article, they said that they're possibly waiting for more companies to exit, meaning to go public and make it big and make the money back to then invest in other companies. Another thing was saying that they could be because of interest rates. So any thoughts on 2024 looking back?
Yeah. So I think 2024 was kind of the tail end of the extension of 2023, which was just brutal in venture and startup land generally. Like that tail end of 2022, kind of heading into 2023 was just a massive freeze, probably like we haven't seen since 2007, 2008 in venture. If you look further, so a little bit longer horizon, I'm actually more concerned about 2024, 2023 relative to previous years and just how much capital is down in the Seattle region. I should have looked this up exactly, but I think the number is around, we used to be closer to like 6 billion. And so if you take a little bit longer horizon, knowing that we're in one of these frozen periods, it's just really unfortunate that, we've got quite a bit less capital focused up here. And at the same time, I think an even higher concentration of capital probably in the Bay Area, right?
Yeah.
A little bit New York as well. They've been, it's this, when you're scared or when things aren't going exactly right, you flee to the comfortable place. And so not just Seattle, but Austin, Miami, all of these cities, not, San Francisco or New York, have kind of seen a pullback in capital, right? The other kind of a part of the equation is how much what we call dry powder is there out there. If you raise a $100 million fund, your investors do not send you $100 million right that day. You actually get that 100 million over probably 3, 4, 5, 6 years.
Okay.
And so we as VCs, we call that capital over time. And a lot of VCs raise funds in 21, 22. And then as things started to freeze, they didn't call the capital. And sometimes that means they're going to call the capital later and they're going to start deploying a bunch more. But it also could mean they're just not going to call the capital.
When you say call the capital, meaning like request the funds be sent them? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Calling the capital is, hey, we're making an investment. It's time for you, limited partner, who's my investor in my venture fund, to send me money so I can make the investment. And so we saw some firms just pull back and say, we're actually not going to call capital from our investors for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months or more. We saw a number of funds, including some of the biggest brand name funds, say, okay, we got $1 billion committed. We're actually going to uncommit half of it.
Ooh.
And we're going to go down to 500 million because we're not sure we can deploy and invest all of that money over the time period, right? And so those are things that I'm more paying attention to because they're a little bit more kind of leading indicators, right? The other thing that's top of mind for me with 2024 and coming in 2025 is a lot of the numbers that we see around the Pacific Northwest and Seattle in particular are really driven by outlier funding rounds. These are 100 million, 250 million, $1 billion funding rounds. And that kind of does a disservice to what is happening on the ground at the pre-seed and the seed, where it might be $500,000 to $3 million. And so, that's where we focus our energy and say, okay, how many deals, how many companies are we seeing? Are entrepreneurs still as excited to build companies as they were before? Are there firms that have capital that want to deploy it and invest it into those early stage companies? And I think what's a potential risk right now, and there's a really great article kind of floating around right now from Precursor Ventures that talks about kind of 3 futures for venture capital. It used to be a very small niche industry with boutique advisory and support and mentorship, right? Then 10-ish years ago, probably post Meta being funded and the size of outcome that Facebook was, we saw this need for firms to raise a lot more money.
Okay.
And so you had Facebook not go public until probably 3, 4, 5 years after the traditional startup would have gone public. But they still needed billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. And so you had these firms that were kind of built to say, oh, we're not going to write $10 million checks. We want to write $100 or $1 billion checks.
Yeah.
And those are some of the biggest firms in the world. And they started to consolidate a lot of this LP money because oftentimes with venture, people pay attention to brand names. So if it's Sequoia or Andreessen, as an LP, you know, it's kind of the old adage, you never got fired for buying IBM. If you are managing an endowment or you're managing a family office, you won't get fired for getting access into Sequoia.
Okay. And
so now you have this massive concentration of those investment dollars. And back to the, you know, your fund size is your strategy. Mm-hmm. A $10 billion fund can't do the work that we're doing here at PAC. And so if you have more of the LP base...
When you say LP, for the listeners, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's limited partner is my investor in my venture fund.
Okay.
So I'm general partner at PAC Ventures. It means I take the risk on behalf of my investors who are called limited partners.
Okay.
And so think of it as they're the people who, you know, buy stock in PAC to go buy stock in startups kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so when you have this concentration of all of those LPs... it kind of strangles out the smaller firms that would do the really early work of a local ecosystem. Because I'm here meeting founders 2 years before they're going out and even incorporating. Mm-hmm. Sequoia and Andreessen don't have enough people to come up here to do that across 50,000 people at UW.
Of course, yeah.
And so I think there's a concern in the venture industry right now that, okay, one path is we go back to kind of what the status quo was. My job as a VC in the earliest stages is to prepare a company to get to that next stage and effectively hand them off to the investor who wants to invest after me, right? I'm a filter.
Yeah.
I say, hey, I worked with them. We got them to the right revenue numbers, the metrics, the science is where it needs to be, whatever it is. Now they're ready for, you know, a bigger check of 5 million or 10 million. Let me help connect them to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you're $1 billion fund, you want to try to do all of those rounds so that you have as much ownership of the company as you possibly can. And so I think a lot of us are waiting to see, and like I shouldn't say waiting because we're out here fundraising and we're out here doing what we're doing. But I think in 10 or 15 years, there will be this really interesting inflection point around 2024 where it's like VC took a pivot back to what it was. There was much more local capital being deployed into companies, or the consolidation happened and, you know, there's 20 brand name VCs.
Yeah.
We'll see.
One of the things you said in the 2025 future is, I think a lot of them agreed that AI is a tech trend for 2025. We're going to see a lot more investment in that. That crypto is a little overhyped.
Yeah.
Is what some of the panelists said.
I don't know. Now we got Trump coins, so maybe it all came back.
Maybe it'll change everything. Is there any kind of final thought you have on looking forward to 2025 and what you think we'll see for the VC industry? Anything else you want to share on that?
Yeah, I think AI is not just the 2025 thing. It's like
the future.
The rest. Yeah, it's it's the rest of our lives. Like the future that we're living in, talking to founders, is hard for me to describe to my parents.
Wow.
Like it's hard for them to grasp how life is going to change and how it's going to work, right? I think the other thing that's really interesting, and we might talk a little bit more about this later, but it's a good time now, is the cost to build a company right now is maybe the lowest it's ever been.
Really?
And we have been dropping the cost to build a startup for like 30 years in a row.
Whoa.
Right? So if you just think about if you were trying to get funding in the late 80s or in the 90s and you wanted to build software, you had to physically spend money on server racks, not just for your own software writing, but for every customer you deployed.
Whoa.
So the fact that you had to, spend that on atoms inherently increased the costs to get started. You might spend $50 or $100 or $500,000 on a server rack just to even start writing the code.
Yeah.
And so the cloud completely revolutionized that because now you could buy that for 2 cents, a minute or whatever it was. But now what we're seeing is the quality of applications you can build with OpenAI's API or Llama, which is the open source model that Facebook put out, but the performance is incredible. You can come deliver value to a customer with maybe 25% the resources you needed before. The question becomes, how much are you going to spend on, OpenAI or NVIDIA or one of these big companies that powers these things? But the level of product we see from a 2-person or 3-person team is just mind-blowing.
Really?
And there's a lot of VCs who are talking about this idea that in the next couple of years, we will see the first single or only 2-person billion-dollar company.
Whoa.
Where you just don't need 100 engineers and 100 salespeople. I never would have thought that could have ever been possible until recently.
Dang.
Yeah, super cool.
Okay, we've got to move on because we've got 2 more things, and I want to make sure we have time to talk about this wine. Okay, but before that, we have Meta to lay off 5% of their workforce based on merit. So what's funny about this is that I listen to the Social Network soundtrack every time I need to really focus.
That's a good one. I'll have to try
is
that.
Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. I love it. It's on my top 5 every year,
Nice.
but I was listening to it as I was prepping for this. So Meta's laying off 5%, and they're going to target low-performing employees. Mark sent out a memo to everybody saying it's going to be an intense year. I want the best of the best, and employees will be notified February 10th. They've already laid off 21,000 people between 2022 and 2023. 5% locally means probably around 400 people, if we're talking about the Puget Sound. And Microsoft also said late last week that they planned to lay off 1% based on low-performing employees. I think it's weird to announce this because people get laid off for performance all the time, and people get put on PIPs and like unreasonable PIPs just because they want to fire them, but they want it to seem like it was a performance. I also question how you really can measure low-performing employees because, in sales, of course, you can do that. As an event person, it's a little harder to do that. So my takeaway from this was just like, why announce it? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. It seems a little bit performative to me. Having worked at Microsoft for a number of years, there was always 2 to 5% layoffs twice a year, right after H1, so that would be January, and then right after fiscal year end, so in July. And it was just the time for the company to say, okay, we probably put you on a PIP 6 months ago. We gave you 6 months to try to work this out. And so that's just a healthy, normal cadence for us to give you time to figure things out, give us time to figure things out. And I think, he'd also made this comment about how they were going to get rid of middle level engineers on, I think, the Joe Rogan podcast or something. And then he comes out with this 3 days later. So yeah, it felt a little bit performative to me, but the other context of this is I think there's a chance that 5% is just the tip of the iceberg for a lot of these companies. With what you can do with these agents and these companions, which is what we're calling this generative AI, it's going to take actions on your behalf. It's literally going to remove hours of work that you would have had to have done as a human. So the last decade was about, don't use that software because it's not very efficient. Use this other software and you'll be a little bit more efficient, which actually just meant you work more hours. This is totally different. While I'm sitting there, we're watching Silo right now, by the way.
Oh my God, I love it. Yes.
It's so intense. So while I'm watching Silo, literally an AI agent is going to respond to an email for me that I didn't even look at or see.
Whoa.
And so I'm actually kind of waiting for the day when you start to see much stronger layoffs where it is just we don't need 80% of these people. And this is what we're seeing in startups. There's people coming to me, almost every founder I talk to, their hiring plan is 75% lower than it would have been
lower,
3 years ago.
Yeah.
And one big thing that we pay attention to is how much capital did it take for you to earn $1 of revenue?
Okay.
And at my stage, the ratio is usually it takes $2, maybe $3 to earn $1.
Okay. Once
the company grows, we want that to start to flip. So usually around the Series A or Series B, it's more like 1-to-1. So you raise $10 million of venture capital, but that turns into $10 million of revenue. Right? That's great. That's very efficient. And then once you get to Microsoft sides, it's totally the opposite. Yeah. You're getting $10 for every dollar you put in, kind of thing, right? I, for the first time, saw a company that had a 2-to-1 opposite ratio. So they were spending half of what it took to go get the money.
Whoa.
So for every dollar they spent, and this is at my stage, this is a company like a year old. For every dollar they spent, they were getting $2. Like that level of efficiency shouldn't happen for 5 or 6 years. And it's because they have 30% of the people that a startup 5 years ago would have had.
It sounds like what you're saying is, no matter what, we've been working 8 hours a day, and we went from a fax machine and like a corded phone to a cell phone. And then we've had all these advancements that are supposedly going to like take our jobs away or make things faster and easier. And that hasn't really changed. We're still doing 8 hours of work. And so you're kind of saying this is a time where that is going to change.
Totally.
Yeah.
We have software we use that does research that would have taken me 30 to 40 hours to do. It does it in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So now I put that somewhere else. And hopefully we get to a point where we put that to fun, creative stuff and not work.
Perfect segue into creative stuff. We could take our sip of wine to move into the wine conversation.
Cheers.
Cheers. And for those listening, yes, I am doing dry-ish January. That didn't change. I am doing dry-ish because I'm trying to just have a better relationship with alcohol moving forward. So that's why I did that for January.
I'm taking the opposite approach.
Oh, yeah?
Just swimming. No.
Pour down, do more and more. Why we're talking about wine is because Capitol Hill's Rapport closed. Their last day of business was December 29th. So David Clausen debuted this place in the summer of 2020. It used to be Roy Street Coffee, if those familiar over there. And he said this whole idea of self-serve wine, because it's one of those ones where I haven't been there actually, but I know I think you probably put your card down and get, I'm guessing, a bracelet and then go tap.
It's like a little scan card.
A card.
You just put it up. Yeah.
It's like a Tapster, if you guys have been to Tapster in South Lake Union.
Just like that.
Similar idea. So you go in, and he said it was really popular in Europe, so we wanted to start it here. And they say due to personal family decisions with the ownership that it's closing, and they're still hoping that somehow they can work out some sort of deal where they still get to do the wine here. Overall,
I hope they do.
I hope they do. I'm bummed, but I thought that was part of the article that was interesting is that they were saying customers are probably going to miss more of the comfort and like the coffee and the beer and wine versus potentially the technology of the self-pour. And you were saying that possibly not. Possibly that was a part of the intrigue to people going there.
Well, I'm super biased because I'm like a wine nerd. Being a sommelier, I pay attention to and geek out about things that like the average wine drinker probably doesn't. And so, just to kind of sum up what it was is you would go into Rapport and there would be usually, I think 50 or 60 different wines from all over the world on tap, perfectly preserved. And you could go pour as low as like an ounce.
Wow.
And I thought it was cool because if, people love wine, but they don't understand it or they're intimidated by it. And it's one of those things where they're like, I know it when I taste it and it's great, right? Yeah. But they don't know that that's probably Sauvignon Blanc and not Chardonnay or whatever. I like the crispness, they might say, or I don't like it to be buttery, whatever that is. And so I thought this was a really cool way that you could like explore the world and try a bunch of different things. And then they also had a section that was like super rare wines. Oh. And so a bottle that might cost you $200 or $300 for a bottle, you could go drink an ounce for like $8, which is a lot.
Right.
But these are things that I would never get
access to. Yeah.
Yeah. Never get a taste. So yeah, I'm kind of bummed about it.
So speaking of you being a sommelier, what's kind of the craze? I've heard stories where you have to like take a sip and then see how the wine like sits on the cup and then you have to guess the year. Like what's something you had to do that was just so crazy? Yeah.
I mean, I've had to do the blind taste testing and fully describe the wine, the acid, the tannins, the alcohol, the mouthfeel, all of these things. But I remember on one of my tests, they on this piece of paper, they showed us a label, like crappy, grainy photo kind of thing. And they just said, describe this wine. Essentially, you had like 250 words. Tell us what the wine is, describe the wine. And all it had was like the name of the vineyard.
Whoa.
And the expectation was you just knew exactly what this wine was based off essentially and it wasn't the name of the vineyard even. It was the name brand of that particular wine. Didn't even say it's, this vintage or this whatever. And yeah, you had to describe everything about it. And I totally got it wrong. Luckily, what I thought it was very close to what it actually was.
Hey, you get points
in
from
terms
me.
of wine style. And so I wrote these things down that work for both of them, not knowing.
Okay.
And so I ended up doing okay, but
There
it
you
was
go.
like, yeah, I had no idea what the wine was.
That is wild. Okay, so talk to me about A Posto Vino.
Yeah.
How and why did you start this company?
Yeah. So this was a passion project that I started with my partner, Andrea. And I started, like most of us during COVID, drinking wine more regularly at home. One of my best friends in college actually grew up in the Napa, Sonoma area, and I was very fortunate to spend a lot of time with him and his family and get to know a lot of the winemakers down there. My family didn't drink growing up. We didn't drink wine. That wasn't a thing in our life. And I really connected with some of the producers down in Sonoma, and they had this very blue-collar feel about them. And so I started to get a little bit more passionate about wine. Start drinking a lot more during COVID, like most people.
Yeah.
And I kind of thought, I might as well study this, figure out what it really is about. And then luckily, just before COVID, a roommate of mine had gotten married to a Sicilian gal.
Okay.
And I drove around Sicily, before and after the wedding. And I was tasting these astonishing wines. And they were 8, 10, 12 euros. Maybe at retail they were 20 euros.
That is cheap. Okay.
And I couldn't find them when I got home. And so Andrea and I came up with this idea, totally lean startup style. I invited 150 friends and family. I bought all the wine. And I said, hey, I just want you to come eat charcuterie and taste wine. And the only thing I ask is that you tell me if you actually like it and just be honest with me. And we put a sign-up sheet out. And when we announced it, we said, hey, if you really like this, we're thinking about starting a company. It'll be 6 bottles of wine a quarter for $150.
It's like a wine club,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But we really didn't know if people would want it. And we had 50 people sign up and say, yeah, you chose really good wines for this event. If you keep choosing more wines like this, we'll do it. And so, yeah, that's how it kind of got started just over a year ago now. We do these really fun pop-up wine events. We actually did one at Rapport a couple months ago, so that's sad. And we've got this just wonderful group of people, and we keep adding more, and we'll continue to add more. And, just to talk about this wine we're drinking for a second.
Please.
So this wine, the brand is Pietra Dita, and the particular vintage is Lahar 2023, I believe. This is grown on the south side of Mount Etna, which is the largest active volcano in Europe. If you've ever had a flight delayed from a volcano in Europe, it was probably Mount Etna, or maybe Iceland.
Dang.
And there's only about 1,000 bottles of this produced a year.
That is not a lot.
No. Okay. And we bought about 15% of his stock.
Whoa.
And we walked his vineyards with him. It's built on a volcano. Lahar means lava flow, and so it's built on a lava flow. The soil is black. And he and his father hand-built the terraced walls. And this is the kind of thing that you get from Sicily, right? It goes back to the Phoenicians making wine there. This kind of producer is too small to get picked up by a normal importer.
Yeah. And you're not going to find this at like Bevmo or Fred Meyer or anything like that.
Never, ever.
Yeah.
And so that's what we wanted to be. Organic, small batch. We've met all of the families for every wine that we sell. And we come and bring those stories and these incredible wines to people who like.
And I went to one of your tasting events, and you were so knowledgeable about everything, and it was really, really fun. Well, thanks for taking the time. I was going to ask if you have any closing thoughts on any advice for our listeners, and that can be personal and professional, or, obviously you work with a lot of founders. What do you want to share with people?
Yeah, maybe on the founder side, I always encourage Seattle founders to think bigger. And we have a tendency here to be very practical and pragmatic. That's why I love being here and working with founders here. And one of the things we help founders do is like, okay, we're going to take you to the Bay and we're going to help you raise money. And so that thing you just pitched me and told me you wanted to build, what does it look like if it's literally 100 times as big?
Dream bigger, yeah.
And let's just sit in that. Mm-hmm. And the things that open up as pathways to you when you think either from the end in mind of how big this could be, or the other kind of Charlie Mungerism, who, famous from Berkshire Hathaway that I like, is invert, always invert. And so this idea of whatever you think the direction is, think about what would happen if it is exactly the opposite.
Oh, I haven't heard that. I like that.
Those two are the two that I try to impart on founders as often as I can.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your wisdom and for the wine and just taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
This has been The Weekly, with production assistance from Nick Patry. If you liked what you heard, rate us and write a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. We love listener feedback, so if you have any story suggestions, comments, or complaints, email us at info@theweeklyseattle.com. Make sure to check back next Sunday for the latest local business news. We'll see you next time.